Welcome to Graphite Hub's interview series, a series dedicated to all things graphite. Now, today I'm joined by somewhat a legend in the battery space, Amy Bennett, principal consultant at Fastmarkets. So, welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Harry. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you on here. So let's begin, Amy, around China. So, China continues to dominate the direction of the graphite market at the moment, larger than kind of any other player at the moment. So, if we could just maybe delve into what's happening in China in a bit more detail. So, if we look at pricing to exports to policy shifts, what are the kind of key trends that you're seeing unfold right now?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. China is really the center of the graphite market. There's no doubt about that. As much as the rest of the world might not like that to be the case, it is the reality. Definitely, I would say the situation in China right now is challenging. Clearly, China has made a very concerted effort over the past several years to essentially be the leader in this space. And they've done that through the addition of vast amounts of capacity, whether on the natural graphite side or the synthetic side. And so, really, what we're left with now is a highly concentrated and oversupplied market. And you can see that certainly in the price development, both in the natural graphite market and the synthetic graphite market. It's been a pretty sad story for anyone trying to produce and make money in this sector. I mean, the Chinese producers themselves are operating at a loss, really, really struggling. Unfortunately, we don't see any immediate turnaround in that situation. Just the supply is too vast, the inventories are too high, demand is not where I suppose the industry would like it to be. Certainly we're not only seeing some slowing in demand from the kind of the global battery sector, but also certainly from the steel sector, demand there is coming down. So it's really a bit of a difficult situation in terms of kind of Chinese policy actions. Obviously, back in December of 2023, they enacted the graphite export controls. We haven't seen a lot of volume reduction from that plan. It's more of a kind of an alarm for the rest of the world to be aware of kind of the dependence on China and the potential for China to shut off that supply. Ironically, however, since those policies were enacted and the rest of the world sort of did wake up to realize, hold on, we've been focusing on some of these other battery raw materials much more than we've focused on graphite. And However, although there was a lot of sort of discussion and it looked like we'd see positive momentum, in fact, over the past year and a half or so, we've seen China's dominance just increase even more in graphite. So it's certainly a challenge. I will say in this, the U.S. China trade war, of course, is a huge bit of the conversation right now. And I will say that with this U.S. China temporary pause in the tariffs, China did intimate that they would kind of relax some of their export controls. But again, I don't think we've seen a real, reduction in their exports at the moment because they need to be selling this material because of course they have too much of it at home.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite a tough time at the moment out there for graphite, and so kind of building on that in a bit more detail. You mentioned graphite prices are quite low at the moment, and I think we saw Fast Markets put out recently that graphite prices are nearing the lowest level since 2018. So, do you think we've truly hit the floor, or potentially do you think weak demand could drive prices even lower?
It's so difficult to say. I will say, at the end of April, prices had fallen below those previous, any previous low prices we'd ever seen before. So we got down to about an average for that, negative 100 mesh FOB China price at about $410 per ton. So that's really, a new low. However, we did see that the kind of the bottom end of the trading range did pick up a bit over the past week or so as China came out of the May Day holiday season. So perhaps that's an indicator that maybe a floor has finally been reached. Maybe producers are gonna put their foot down and hold the line. It could also be influenced by the weakening Chinese currency versus the dollar. Of course, that gives them a little bit more cushion as well. So it's difficult to say. I would love to say, oh, absolutely, that's the floor. We're not going to go any lower, but I would be very hesitant and reluctant to do so just because there are clearly some headwinds still
Yeah,
out there.
yeah, and I feel there's quite a few factors at play that can either go that can impact the graphite price either way. So I think time will tell,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. And uncertainty is terrible for markets in general. And that's what we have so much of right now. It's
Yeah,
a truly, truly difficult time.
yeah. No, it'll be interesting to have you back on in maybe 6 months' time, and we can kind of see how the trade wars played out and what impact that's had on graphite.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, in light of these low graphite prices, we're seeing it take quite a significant toll on producers out there at the moment. And so, given how steep these price drops have been, some producers are having to halt operations or reduce output. So, what do you think this means for the sustainability of current production? Do you see kind of more closures happening, or could reduced output start to, I guess, somewhat rebalance the market?
I would say, really looking at the data, we have seen some rebalancing happening on the natural graphite side of the market. There really have been some very substantial production cuts, particularly from producers like Syra in Mozambique. So that is helping to balance the situation. The problem is, I think even any rebalancing we're seeing there is just so overwhelmed by what's happening on the synthetic graphite side of the market that it's sort of masking any improvement that we're seeing potentially on that natural graphite side. So it's definitely a difficult situation. We obviously saw Chinese production of natural graphite decline over that winter period. Interestingly, we did see their Chinese imports from African countries, particularly Tanzania and Madagascar, pick up over the first quarter of the year. So it'll be interesting to see if those increased shipments to China continue once Chinese production is back up to normal levels. So that'll be another kind of something to watch in the data as well.
Yeah, add it to the list.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And so, zooming out a bit to look at the current global kind of trade dynamics, we're seeing a shift towards greater self-sufficiency in trade, particularly, in the US. And so, with tariffs and trade barriers kind of on the rise, especially, yeah, as I said, in the US, do you anticipate pricing disconnect between ex-China and China, or is the global graphite market still globally aligned at this stage?
Yeah, we definitely have seen some diverging in prices between China and, say, the European price and certainly the US price as well. However, it's really important to note that the vast majority of this material is really still very China based. So while we're looking at an FOB China price, we're looking at CIF prices in the other markets. So we're not looking at, say, a European supply price or a North American supply price. That's not, we're not there yet for sure.
Yeah.
And interestingly, over the past, couple of years prior to the kind of the trade war that we're seeing at the moment, one thing that I had really been speaking about in my presentations at various events was that we really do need to see some sort of price premium evolve in Europe and the US in order to actually encourage this domestic localized capacity for graphite in other regions and you kind of to break the stronghold on China. And funnily enough, looking at the experience in other markets like the steel industry and things, I had kind of projected maybe we would see a 20 to 30% increase or a premium for Europe and the US relative to China. Well, of course, with the trade war, suddenly those numbers are blown out of the water. Obviously, now we've had this 90-day pause between the US and China. But prior to that, we were looking at these, particularly the anode tariffs at 170% for the material coming from China. And that's just, like how do consumers cope with that in the near term? It's impossible. So now we've withdrawn that at least. So we're looking at on the natural graphite side of the market. So the Chinese materials can be subject to just, the 20% tariffs, and the synthetic graphite material is going to be subject to about 55% tariffs. So, and that's including the Section 301 tariff of 25% on the synthetic graphite that the natural graphite is not yet subject to. So we're looking at, perhaps the potential for premiums more in line with what we had originally forecast, kind of prior to, these crazy numbers that we've been hearing over the past couple of months. So definitely, we see that the US and Europe will maintain a premium structure versus China. And to be honest, over the past year, we've actually really seen that in our spread between European and Chinese prices on that flake graphite side, where we've seen, the traditional premium for Europe was only about $30 to $35 per ton, really, kind of a freight cost differential. Well, now we're seeing those differentials at about $200 per ton. So Europe has really widened the price range over China already. So this is certainly something we see being maintained going forward.
Okay, cool. And so stepping back, I guess to look at more of a strategic view of the battery market, an ongoing debate that I see come up quite often is the split going forward between natural and synthetic graphite. So could you share what Fastmarkets kind of assumptions are looking forward to how this split will be maintained?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the moment, when you look at the graphite market, because that anode supply is really dominated by China, essentially the global picture is the China picture. So right now we're seeing sort of a, 10 to 15% natural, 85 to 90% synthetic split in the market. However, we do expect to see that evolve over the next, decade, where we see once some of this localized supply, whether it's in Europe or North America, once these supply chains become a bit more established, we do expect to see a growing preference for natural versus synthetic in some of these markets, largely because just from an environmental perspective, I think natural graphite is considered perhaps the preferable product in terms of manufacturing outside of China. There are, of course, exceptions to this, but that's kind of our general view. Natural graphite was typically the less expensive product as well. So we'll see how that actually evolves. But at this point, we're thinking, it'll be kind of this China dominated split, maybe going to 20 natural, 80 synthetic in the next couple of years. And then from when we get to about 2027 onwards, that's when we're starting to let these markets diverge a bit. So we're going to gradually ramp up the natural graphite share of in the anodes in North America, Europe, some of those countries, whereas we're going to keep the China picture very highly, 80% synthetic for the long run. So we might end up, say by, the end of the next decade even, or, maybe 2035, say 10 years from now, we could see Europe and North America at like a 50-50 split. But we expect, China, India, some of these other places to remain much more heavily synthetic.
Right, okay, that's good to know. And yeah, hearing that 50-50 split in Europe, something that hasn't really been spoken about too much. People kind of look at the market as a whole, I guess, rather than splitting it up. So
Yeah.
that's interesting to hear. Cool. I understand also next month you'll be attending the Fastmarkets Conference in Las Vegas. Would you mind maybe just sharing a bit about what that conference is shaping up to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously a big section of that conference is going to have to focus on policy in the US. Particularly, it is a US conference, but obviously attracts delegates from around the world, largely to see what is going to happen next. So I expect there to be a lot of conversation on tariffs. In terms of graphite, how about that anti-dumping case? What's going to happen there? So we should have some updates on that by then. Certainly, as well, I think the other big conversation will be about legislative changes. There's been so much conversation about what will happen with the IRA and the BIL and these tax credits, the IRS 30D consumer tax credit, the 45X manufacturing tax credits. At this point, everyone is waiting for the Congress to work on these tax bills, see what's going to come out. We have no news yet. I think the only thing we've really heard so far is that the expectation is that the 30D will be cut, and then the 45X will probably be amended to include an FEOC component. So that's what we're kind of expecting to see there. But anyhow, these will be, I'm sure, huge topics of conversation in Las Vegas. Turning more specifically to graphite, I expect there to be a lot of discussion about what is happening with these ex-China supply chains. Are they feasible? How do we make this work? Are the OEMs and the cell makers actually willing to pay a higher price for this material? And so I would imagine those are the sorts of conversations we'll be having.
No, that sounds like it'll be a fascinating conference. So yeah, look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, absolutely. You too.
Cool. Well, appreciate your time, Amy. It's been great to have you on here, and we look forward to having you on here again in the future.
Thank you so much, Harry.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning into this episode of Graphite Hub's interview series. We'll see you next time.